You know, the first book is the book of Genesis. The title doesn't really do it justice. The title is just based on the first word, in the beginning. But the book of Genesis is much more than that. The book of Genesis deals with the call to trust God. It presents the promise of God. Matter of fact, the key term of Genesis is the promise of redemption. That's the key thought. And what God is doing, He is working to restore mankind who has chosen to separate themselves from God, who has chosen to rebel, and they have received the judgment of God in that aspect. But it's not a judgment which crushes. It's a judgment which reveals and tries to draw back in and then promises hope and redemption. So, and that promise, which begins in the early chapters of Genesis and is developed more fully with Abraham, is going to be seen throughout this book. And when you reach the end of this book, you understand sin and what it has done. You begin to understand the promise of God and the hope that's found therein. And you're challenged to enter into faith and begin to trust and walk with God as you begin to grow and understand what He wants to do in your life. So the book of Genesis is about this promise of redemption and how we interact with it.
I think we see actually that cycle with Abraham himself, learning what it means to be a child of faith, if you will. Mm-hmm. Then he becomes obviously the father of faith in that. But it's interesting how you see that cycle at work in Genesis in that principal character.
I know Genesis is a wonderful book to read because you actually see yourself in many of the stories. And it does have a lot of stories, which I think are very interesting.
So that is interesting, though, that as you think about the end of Genesis, you have Joseph, who is the kind of like one of the consummate men of faith, who actually starts to figure out what this faith and how that translates into faithfulness to God and His desires for life, how that translates into Joseph's life. That actually leads then into the setting for the book of Exodus, which is number 2 in the Torah.
So you start out with Genesis, which has the relationship at the beginning, the break of that relationship, and then the promise of the restoration. What Exodus does, it gives us the drama of redemption. And that's what it's almost like if I could stage and put together a picture which revealed the essence of what God is doing, it would be Exodus. And so there's 3 actual stages that it develops in, and these 3 stages are going to become the pattern for God's redemption. So you're dealing with God working with Israel when they're in Egypt. And you have God's power and deliverance given there. He brings them out of Egypt. Then you have them assembling around Mount Sinai. And all of a sudden you sense God's words, and you hear God begin to talk, and He gives His principles of life as He begins to work in their hearts. And then the last part is centered around the building of a tabernacle. And it's like God's presence is now in their midst. So it's this drama of what God wants to do. He wants to redeem us. He wants to educate and help us grow and be transformed. And then He wants to live with us as He had originally intended. And when you go through the Bible, you see those are the 3 developments of salvation or of redemption. We call it justification, sanctification, and glorification. But they mean we get our life is declared righteous. We begin to look like God, and now we enjoy the essence and the glory and the presence of God. And by the way, all 3 of those were celebrated. This drama is, Exodus is an amazing book because you look at it and you go, oh, this all fits together. And you'll find portions of it in all 5 of the books. The first part of Exodus, the one that deals with the deliverance from Egypt, is talking about the Passover. And the Passover, those 3 festivals during that season were celebrated to remember that. When they were at Mount Sinai, one of the festivals is Pentecost, which means 50. Mm-hmm. And it refers to 50 days after they came out of Egypt. And so they're celebrating the giving of the law. And as God begins to give us guidance and helps us grow and to be transformed in our life. And that's celebrated in the festival of Pentecost. And then building the tabernacle is celebrated in another festival called Tabernacles. There are 3 of them that are celebrated there. So Exodus is given so that we begin to understand how God is going to work his plan of salvation. It becomes a picture which we remember and celebrate.
So it's almost like you see this threefold cycle repeated all the way throughout not only the Pentateuch, or the Torah, but throughout the entire Old Testament and on into the New, right?
Right.
Awesome.
Now we come to the real interesting one, and that is Leviticus. Leviticus was one that I always said in Bible reading, it's the graveyard of all people who want to read the Bible through in 1 year. They get to Genesis, they love it, they love going through Exodus, they hit Leviticus, and about halfway through they get deathly sick and just die right there. But actually, when you begin to see what Leviticus is about, you go, oh, now it is about a lot of details. But what it is about, it's about learning to enjoy walking with God. It's about fellowship with God. And the word holiness begins to take form in that book. It says, be holy as I am holy. It's talking about enjoying the actual presence and things that God do, to always be with God. And so it starts out by talking about our sin, which has separated us from God. And we think, it's hard to understand it, but basically sin means I would rather be doing something with somebody else than God. And I want my life to be as fulfilling as it would be as if I were with God. But it never is, because it lacks the very essence of life and what we were created for. So, but it talks about understanding sin and what separates us from God, and it shows in a picture form about how God has been involved in his grace and love, making it possible for us to deal with the sin, not only the action but the heart attitude, and begin to come back to God, and so that those sins are reconciled, and I can become God's follower and walk with him. In the very middle of the book, it deals with the Day of Atonement, which talks about and prefigures God sending his Son to die for us, to cover all of our sins and deal with the sin problem. On both sides of that Day of Atonement, it deals with ceremonial cleanliness and moral cleanliness. And I tell you, it talks about some pretty unusual things. It challenges you. You go, oh, my lands. It's all in. And then the last part deals with what we call the festivals that were introduced in Exodus. And those festivals give the development of God's plan. So we can actually look and say, oh, God is doing his plan. For instance, the first set of the festivals, Passover, was fulfilled when Jesus Christ died, was buried, and rose again. And 50 days after he rose again, what happened? Pentecost came. So we have the first 2 stages of God's plan of salvation already intact. We've seen it happen. And we look forward to the last one, which is called Tabernacles. So if God has been faithful in the first 2, he will be faithful in the last one. And that brings us to Numbers. Really what it's about the journey in the desert, from Mount Sinai entering into Canaan. So what it involves is the disciplines of growing up, and God taking them through the various stages of development and how they respond. And it becomes lessons for us as to where we place our faith in trials, where we place our faith in temptations, where we place our faith in pleasures.
So Numbers almost becomes like the growing pains of like adolescence. So we're almost seeing this whole journey as Exodus, God is birthing a new relationship. So it's like a birth. And then Leviticus becomes kind of the structure around how to interact. Numbers is this really often painful process of growing into something that I'm sure leads us to the next book. But
yeah, well, the next book is really what we call is Deuteronomy. It means second law, but really what it is the agreement, the covenant agreement that God makes with Israel. And it's an agreement where God actually binds himself with Israel. It's what we call a binding of love. And all the way through it, it's about what God does. And it's amazing the things that he does for his people. And then he calls them to bind with him in a mission not only of their life, but that's going to restore the world. And so he reviews their history in this document, in this covenant, to show what has happened to them. And then he gives them 10 words which become foundations of life and relationship. And then the rest of the book explains how those 10 words play out in actual life.
10 Commandments?
Yes, we call them the 10 Commandments.
Sure.
Yeah, that's right. And they play out in life so that we begin to understand how to apply them. And then he explains at the very end, if you do this, it'll be great for you. If you don't, you're going to struggle. As a matter of fact, let me read some of the things, what he says. And he ends with this final challenge. He says, "The word is very near you. It is in your mouth and in your heart so that you may obey. See, I set before you today life and prosperity, death and destruction." And what he's saying there is, you have a choice before you. You can decide to make a covenant or a treaty with the nations who are heading toward death and destruction, who are always struggling and fighting, full of anxiety and fear. And you'll find that that's where you will be. Or you can make a covenant with me, and you can be part of the process that brings people to truth and enables them to be restored to God.
Wow. It's really neat to see as you look back at the Torah or the Pentateuch, to see all that movement from Genesis through to Deuteronomy that then will undoubtedly drop us off into, like, Deuteronomy ends with Moses at the other side of the Jordan. The people are ready to go take possession of the land that God didn't just promise to them, but promised to their ancestor Abraham. Mm-hmm. So God is about to be faithful to that, but this, I think you read out of Deuteronomy 30, right?
Yes.
So you kind of land there, you're on the other side of the Jordan, you're about to go in, and there's this second law, right? That's what Deuteronomy means. There's this, hey, one more time, let's remember how faithful God is. Yeah. So before you go in, just to know that his past faithfulness is going to be the thing that secures or reinforces the confidence that you have when you take this inheritance in there. And that's what we'll find as we go into the book of Joshua and beyond, right?
We will. When we look at the Torah as a whole, then it really becomes a covenant between God and his people. People that he has given birth to, he has trained them, right. And now he wants them to take hold of him and enter into this journey together. So it's a call to trust God and to follow him.